When it comes to facial setup, there's all kinds of ways to control a face. Using blendShape, using joints, um, using influence objects. Now, what if we could find a way to sort of combine some of those methods to sort of lighten the load a little bit? So right here what you see is sort of a mirror image of the face that I've created using curves. And now also hidden are curves that are basically aligned with the face. Now on those curves there are joints which have actually been mounted to the curves. Now instead of creating the setup so that I have to duplicate specific sections individually and basically make controls for those sections individually, essentially I just have to make a duplicate of the whole mirrored structure and then apply it to the other mirrored structure around the main face as a blend shape. And therefore any changes that go on within, whether it's just on, let's say, an eyelid bottom or on the mouth, it automatically applies it to my face. Okay, so it's actually a fairly simple setup once you get to that point, but before that you need to actually create this structure. So first, of course, you need a face. Okay, so this is just the face of a character I've been working on, and let's just stick it in and put it so it's pretty low poly, it's not super high, doesn't need to be. The geometry creates all the contours I need, and I have enough edge loops for what I want. So there we go. So now to first get started, we can do a couple of different things. You could either select the mesh, go to modify, and switch it to make live. And this is so that we can actually start basically tracing out the areas where we actually want to add curve control. It's usually a good idea to throw on your wireframe so you can actually see where you're dropping your curves. Go to create, and you can pretty much use any one of the curve tools that you prefer. I usually use the CV curve tool, which I tend to leave set as linear by default. It's just my preference. If I need more of a contour, I can just rebuild the curve or change the setting. So basically you want to go around and start putting in curves where you think you're going to want control. So if I want control around the eye, I'm going to start clicking out a curve that follows the topology. And so let's say this is going to be the under eye or the bottom lid, and then I can go through it again, top lid. And so basically I'm just going to keep doing this every place where I want to actually create a series of controls. Okay, so if I wanted something, let's say, I don't know, around this jaw, let's come in and plot a few points through here. Now usually I do at least 4 so that I have a fairly solid curve mapped out there. And of course around the mouth you'll need some around the lips. And if you do want to be a bit more precise with this, instead of just doing this, basically the snapping to the geometry itself using the make live, I'm actually going to snap specifically, because I'm disabled make live, and I'm going to use my tool. I'm going to actually snap to point. This way I can actually snap directly to the surface of the geometry so that I'm sure that the curves that I'm creating are going to follow the contours perfectly. In many ways I prefer snapping directly to the geometry just because I'm sure that the alignment is going to be perfect on both sides of the mouth. So I won't have any, so when I actually start adding my joints to the curves, because that's sort of the next stage, I'm going to be sure that the joints are going to be in equal opposite positions so I can easily paint weights on one side and then mirror them across. So clicking out all of my curves, top lip, bottom lip, and so on. Basically wherever you're going to want to have curves. So now I have my curves. I'm going to temporarily disable geometry selection so I can just quickly select my curves and just show all the curves I've created. So those are my curves. Going to modify, center pivot, so I can bring the pivot points up. And so I can just pull these right off of the face if I want to, just to make them a little easier to see. Okay? And so we'll leave them just above it. Okay, so now I need to get my top lid and my bottom lid and my sort of my cheek curve, and I need to replicate them for the other side. So it's pretty simple. You just want to Control D, duplicate, can group them, Control D again, and then in your channels box set the scale X to -1, so it just basically flips them across, and then you can ungroup them and then go to modify and freeze transformations. Okay, so this way we have curves for the left and the right side. Now I probably wouldn't create one for the cheek, so my geometry isn't super dense there, but just for the demo I'll do it. Now just like anything you create, I want to go through and name it. I'm going to leave mine with the prefix of curve, just for myself. You want to label things, of course, relative to where they are as well, so left and right. So it's going to be my lid, bottom, left, so on and so forth. Okay, so lid top underscore left. Okay, so once you have all of your joints, all of your curves labeled, let me just hide the geometry for a second. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want to create basically something to control the mesh, because these curves aren't going to control the mesh directly. They're always going to control it indirectly. And so what we're going to use to control the mesh are basically joints, like this. Now what I did is I created the joints in a way so that even though they are connected to the curve, I can still come in and manipulate the joints individually to use them as sort of a secondary controls to further offset any behavior. So even once I start setting up very specific blend shapes, I can still go in and tweak them just to create additional deformation and to enhance anything. So I need to create a joint. So joint, skeleton, joint tool, and then down at my grid, I'm just going to create a joint. Okay, so it's going to have global orientation by default, and by default it's just called joint, which is fine. If you want to be specific, you could say joint face. Now what I like to do is I like to Control G it, so it actually creates a group around the joint while I have it selected. And then I'll just label that GRP, and we'll call this one control joint. Okay, so that's my first group. Okay, so now the trick is getting this joint to connect into the curves. It's actually pretty easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the group that's around the curve, because I want to make sure that the joint has no incoming connections. I'm going to select the group, and then I'm going to shift select the curve I want to attach it to. So let's say it's going to be the bottom lid, and then go to the animate menu. In the animation menus, I'm going to go down to motion paths. I'm going to tell it to attach to motion path. So as soon as I do that, it actually takes my group and it actually attaches it to the curve. Okay, and so when that comes up in channels box, you're going to see under inputs it'll say motion path, because it created a motion path and it created keyframes. So if I actually went into my UI, brought back up my time slider and my range slider, if I scrub through, you see that our joint group is traveling along a curved surface. So that's actually good because we can actually use that to position our joint. And then once it's in a position that we like, let's say I wanted it right in the middle, which is around, let's say, 0.5. Okay? Then I can come in and I can break the connection on the U value. Just simply select it, left click on the motion path, and then U value, the name, and then delete selected. And then that's broken, so when I scrub the timeline now, it doesn't budge. And so if I actually show my polygon face, you'll see that the joint is positioned more or less where I want it. If I want to adjust it, I can come in and just tweak the U value. If it's kind of hard to do it by scrubbing, you can just come in and type to make adjustments. So if, let's say, 0.45. I mean, basically whatever it's going to give you the position that you want for the joint. And of course you can come in and take your joint, you can sort of scale down its radius a bit so it's not so visually obtrusive. Okay, so I put mine down to around 0.1 in the radius. And so essentially you need to go through and repeat that process for essentially every CV that you have created relative to the intersections on the geometry until you have something like this. Okay? Now in this case I've also created a separate floating joint, and this is sort of just acting as sort of my anchor, sort of a head joint, a stand-in. Now one thing I did do is I went through and I actually created a script that would help me speed up this process. So I can just select the group, I can shift select any curve, and then I activate my script and I tell it how many joints I want to create. So in this case I usually do about 3 or 4 for the eyelids and for the lips. So I tell it I want 3, and it can ask me for a specific name for them if I want. So I'm going to call these my lid top left, and there you go. It creates them and it basically aligns them, and if I don't like the position I can go in and adjust the motion path. Okay, so once you have all of your joints on their curves and everything is connected and looks like it's working fine, you can even test it if you want to. Just grab a CV just to make sure everything follows, undo it, make sure it snaps back to its default position. Okay, so once you're happy with all of that, then you can sort of move on to some of the next steps to finalizing the setup, because we're not quite there yet. So one thing I like to do is I'll go to my front view and I'll come in, and then I'll once again go to my create curve tool, and I can use that, or I can go to NURBS primitives and I'll just create a circle, and we'll bring our circle up to our face. Okay, got my circle here. I'm going to scale it down, rotate it about 90 degrees so that it's facing us. Okay, and so now usually I'll place that around the face and I'll use it as sort of a guide. And this is just more of a stylistic thing, not really something that's necessary. Essentially you do need the circle, because this is sort of going to be sort of a panel of sorts that's going to basically house our control curves. This just makes it a little easier to keep track of things and stay organized, which is always important when it comes to rigging, organization. Okay, so that's good enough. So yes, freeze it. And of course, name it. And so I'll call this one my curve. Actually, we'll call it my BS, my blendShape curve. And we'll call it main or master. Okay, so I can go back to perspective, And let's just make sure that I'm going to align it with the face. I'll just put it sort of around it, not necessarily behind it. Once I'm happy with the position and all that, then what I usually do is I actually select every single one of my curves. Not the joints, just the curves. Shift select my master curve and I just parent all those curves directly to it so that when I actually pick up that curve and move it, it takes the joints and everything with it. So this becomes sort of a, as I said, a master curve. It controls the positioning of your curves and keeps everything together. So at this point, you may have noticed that I also have a third face, which actually has a jaw and a neck joint structure in it. And that's because I usually do not put this structure inside of the main mesh. It's essentially a secondary structure used to control the main mesh. And this is just so that I can keep the main mesh fairly light. And if there is a problem with the setup, I can actually easily either completely replace it or make repairs to it without actually causing any problems to the main mesh. So this would have to be a structure that would have to be maintained within the scene file, but it could be hidden, put away someplace out of the way. So once you have all of your joints, you have your curves set up the way you want, you have any extra joints added in that you need, then we can actually start figuring out how this is going to work. Now ahead of time you can actually select your master curve now and you can duplicate it to start making essentially your blend targets, because your curves are going to be what you're going to manipulate on the blend target to create blend shapes. And so I just made my first duplicate and I'll set it aside for now. So even before we get to the blend shaping part of our process, we need to take our joints and we need to bind them to our face. Because when we're actually setting up our blend shape, since we do not have a piece of geometry over here to work with, we're going to have curves, we do need to see how things are going to deform. So this is where you're going to have to actually start painting your weights. And of course, since our face is not going to be connected to the main body, we sort of need another joint to sort of act as an anchor to basically keep things in line, to sort of absorb the weights that we aren't going to feed out to these joints. Now, we can't have these joints control everything. They need to control specific parts of the face, so we need a joint to absorb that. Just create a joint, make sure that it's centralized, so make sure that it's aligning with the center of the characters of the face. And we can just pull it back into the geometry and just position it someplace where it can absorb the most weight. And you're also going to use it to help out with the deformations when you're painting weights. And so I'm going to call this joint and we'll call it anchor extra, because it's going to basically absorb control of everything we don't need to control. And so in this case, what I usually do is I'll have that joint selected, I'll select my master curve, and then I'll just create a sort of a unifying group around all of that. And this is so that in my outliner it's all organized together and I don't have to look for things later. center pivot on that. Okay, so that we have our group. And so when I move the group, you can see it actually moves everything. And again, this is a place where the joints don't need to be in that group. But for organization's sake, you can do that because this kind of looks like a big mess in our outline. So what I like to do is I'll select all of my groups from my facial joints, including the groups for the corners, and I'll take them and I'll just group them, and I'll call that my BS joint group, BS joints. So that's going to house all of my joints for controlling the face within the blend shapes. Okay, and then we have our master group. I'll call it my group master BS for blend shape. Now, what I usually do, just for organizational sake, is I'll actually take this group that I created just for the joints. I'll have it selected, go to the attribute editor, and I'll disable its inherits so that I can easily take this group now, which now will just basically be a folder, and I can add it into my master group. And even though it's added to the master group, since the inherits are disabled, nothing in that joint group will respond to the translation or rotation that occurs on the master control now. But it basically just keeps everything to organizing together in our outliner. Okay, so there is a way to disable those inherits if you need to. So now we're ready to actually start binding. And to do that, we're just going to simply select all of our joints, including your anchor joint, and then shift select the face or the head or whatever you're working with. Go to skin, smooth bind, and use whichever settings that you're most comfortable with. I usually like doing selected joints. If you want, you can use one of the newer binding methods like the geodesic voxel. That sort of scans the geometry and looks at distances and all that stuff. It does some pretty cool stuff. And I usually always set my normalized weights to interactive. And I'll basically do distance. You could even try neighbors out, and sometimes I get a pretty good result with that. And max influences, usually 2 to 3 is usually good. Fall off is fine as is. And I always disable the maintain max influences. Don't need it, because you want to have as much control over weight distribution as you can, and that prevents it, so don't turn that on. No. And I disable the colorize the skeletal joints because it never really helps me out. And that should be about it. Everything else you can usually leave at default, and then just go for it. Bind skin, let it do its job. And then you can come in and just sort of grab your joints and see what's going on with their weights. So far, some of the weights are actually pretty good. And the great thing about the joints is since they are zeroed out because of the group around them, I can easily just go in and type 0 to reposition them. Okay? And so that's basically just testing the joints. Now, if we want to also, of course, test our curves. Curves aren't bound, but they still are controlling. So we can grab those and see what they're doing. And so we can actually get a pretty good idea of some weird things that are going on with the weights. Okay. Now, also you want to double check, make sure that you didn't actually accidentally bind any of your curves or bind the mesh to any of your curves, because only the joint should be controlling the face at this point. Okay, so one thing you want to do before you start painting weights, honestly, what you could have done, instead of adding all of the joints at once, I'm fine with adding them all at once. This way you don't have to go back and add influence. You can select your face, do the paint skin weights, and then select the joint anchor and basically just flood it with full control. And then you can go back through and adjust the weights for everything else. Also, when you're painting weights, make sure that you're not smooth previewing, because you want to see exactly what's being controlled. Also, when you're actually painting weights, the smooth preview tends to give you a false sense of where the intersection of the vertices are, so when you're painting weights, you're kind of brushing in the wrong area. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically flood the entire thing. I'm going to give my anchor full control, and then I go back and then start painting specific control for my individual joints. Now I bound them all together at once, so that, like I said, I don't have to go back in and bind them individually, because essentially I'd still have to end up painting weights for them individually anyway. So then just go through and start adding weights. Now one thing that I tend to do is I always give full control to any vertices that are in the immediate area. Beyond that, I will sort of give it marginal control within the surrounding area. So basically, any vertices that are specifically in that area, the joint that is directly over those or nearest to those vertices gets full control. And this way, all I'm doing when I'm going back and doing cleanup is I'm just smoothing or softening the deformations that result from that, essentially that influence. Okay, so once you're happy with your weights and you've tested everything to make sure that everything deforms like it needs to, hopefully you've got some nice smooth deformations coming out of your weights. Then you don't really need to see the joints for a while. So you can go to show and just uncheck joints so you're just seeing the mesh and you just have your curves. Also, now that you have, if you've already made your duplicate of your master, like I did, then what we can do with the current master, we can actually just select all of those curves, not the mesh, just the curves, and we can actually lock all of its attributes, because we should not be moving the curves at all. They don't need to move, they don't need to translate, scale, or anything, because everything we're going to be manipulating is going to be in our duplicate blend shape control curves. Okay, so let's say we're going to do something with the mouth. We have our mouth here, and we need to control the mouth here. Now, in order to do that, we need to assign our mouth curve here so that it becomes a blend shape for our master. So select the mouth curve, shift select the master, create deformers, blend shape, give it a name. So we'll just call it mouth for now. And default's fine, create it. Okay, it creates it, and you can go in and turn it on. Now, ideally when you turn it on, nothing should happen. That means nothing's wrong, at least not yet. Okay, so now you can come in and do some testing. Even though I called it mouth, we can test on pretty much any part of it. Right click, vertex, and test. See if everything moves. So as you can see, I have full control over the joints that are controlling the face, or in this case the curves controlling the joints. So if I do want to come in and make a blend shape for my mouth, I can come in. I can even use my soft selection tool to help me select and make very organic deformations of the mouth. Now, the one problem with working this way is that you have to remember you're making changes to these curves that are going to act as blend shapes. So your changes, consider that they're just going to be permanent changes for that duplicate. So you can always keep making duplicates from the original. You'll have to remember to unlock a couple of things so you can manipulate it. But you're only going to need to manipulate the master. So duplicate it, unlock its translates just so you can move it away. Or we can just leave those unlocked. This way we can make our duplicates, move it over, rename our master something else. So this could be the ooh mouth shape. And then we can come into the mouth select the CVs, and then manipulate the CVs until they actually form the shape that we need. Okay, so we can take them, we can scale them in, we can pull them up a little bit, come in. Again, you can use your soft selection to help you make your deformations, and just start doing whatever you need to do to get the shapes that you need. Okay, so that in this case I haven't added this one as a blend shape yet, so you don't really see it updating on the main mesh, but I'm creating the shape I need. Okay, so what I can do now is, now that I have the shape that I need, I can come in, select it, shift select the master, and since I already have a blend node on there, I can come in and go to edit deformers, blend shape, go to add option box, and I can just add it in there. Or I can create a brand new node. I like to just add things in. This way I'm not creating too many extras. Okay, and I can just turn that on, and you can see it immediately. It's deforming perfectly. Okay, and that you can attribute to a combination of the blend shapes and of course the skin weights from your joints. And so it makes it really easy to make blend shapes for your face, and it keeps it really light because these curves weigh almost nothing, while duplicates of the geometry become very, very heavy. So once you're happy with all of your blend shape curves and they've been added to your master, don't forget that you still have the option of creating regular blend shapes and adding them to your proxy face. And then your proxy face can be added, since it's going to be added to your main face, it'll pass through not only your curve driven blend shapes, but your geometry driven blend shapes if you choose to make them. Also, you still have the option of setting up controls to manipulate the joints on that are aligned with the face as well, as a sort of a third option to offset any deformation that occurs in your blend shapes. So you could easily set up a control panel to control those using direct connections or even driven keys, using attributes to help you control those third level controls.